Good evening. Welcome to kind of an unusual setting for the IOP. And let me explain why. Each year we host an event to honor the legacies of the late David and Ann Broder, who are two distinguished alums of the university and benefactors of the IOP. As many of you may know, David Broder was the preeminent political journalist of his time, first at the New York Times and for 40 years as the chief political writer and columnist for the Washington Post. He was a brilliant analyst of American politics. As reflected in this paragraph he wrote about Richard Nixon during the Republican National Convention in 1972, at which Nixon was renominated en route to a landslide re-election victory. He wrote, "Richard M. Nixon has achieved something rather remarkable in the last 4 years. He has managed to shift the program and politics of the Republican Party vast distances in both the foreign and domestic fields, while reducing the GOP's liberal and conservative wings to a series of feeble and futile squawks. He has managed this feat by being progressive in his policies and conservative in his politics, which is rather a neat trick even for one as nimble as Mr. Nixon." For commentary like this, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1973. But beyond his trenchant analysis, what distinguished Dave Broder was the relentless assiduousness with which he reported from the heart of America. He didn't cover politics from a perch in Washington or a campaign plane being spoon-fed by political operatives. No, he famously traveled the country on his own, knocking on doors, stopping in diners and gas stations and bowling alleys and VFW halls, wherever he could find a good conversation with Americans and about their lives and communities and the things that were driving their attitudes about politics. At one of our previous events, Broder events, two of his celebrated proteges, Dan Baltz and David Marinis, recalled one lunch in the cafeteria at the Post late in Broder's career. It was just a few months after a presidential campaign that had just ended, and Broder turned to them and said, "Don't you feel like jumping on a plane, going up to New Hampshire and knocking on doors again?" And that was the enthusiasm that characterized his remarkable career. He was endlessly fascinated by the American people and this process of democracy, and it showed in every piece that he wrote. I was one of the young political reporters who came of age in Broder's heyday and learned from his example, but I only met his wife, Ann, after he had passed away. And what I learned was that she was a quick-witted, incisive, and indefatigable force in her own right, a good government activist, school board member, and champion of myriad causes in their home of Arlington, Virginia. So we're honored to be associated with the Broders, their passion for democracy and for good journalism as one of its most fundamental cornerstones. And so, of course, we're thrilled to welcome another Pulitzer Prize winner, investigative reporter David Farenthold, now of the New York Times, then of the Washington Post. You kind of went the opposite direction from Broder. I'm sure, though, that the Broders would have been thrilled that you're here, and we're grateful to you and to my old friend Marianne Ahern, the longtime Emmy Award-winning political reporter for WMAQ television here in Chicago, and we look forward to your conversation. And now, just a few housekeeping notes. After the moderated discussion, we'll open the floor to take questions from the audience. Please line up to ask your question at the microphone. As usual, we'll give priority to the first questions to be asked by our students. As usual, although they always drop this from this text, I want to remind you that questions begin with end with a question mark. And as one more housekeeping note, please put your phones on silent. And now we'll hear formal introductions from Ronan O'Callaghan, a third-year student at the college majoring in history. Ronan currently serves as the editor-in-chief of The Gate, the undergraduate political review at the Institute of Politics. So please join me in welcoming Ronan to the platform.
Thank you very much, and hello, everyone. As David said, my name is Ronan, and I'm the editor-in-chief of The Gate at the IOP, and I'm a third-year history student from Boston. And it is my honor to introduce David Fahrenthold. David has an illustrious career, having worked as a reporter for The Washington Post and having served as a political an analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. And David is now an investigative reporter for the New York Times, focusing on the world of nonprofits. Some of David's most recognized work pertains to his investigations of President Trump and his family. He won a Pulitzer Prize in 2017 for his investigation into the Trump Foundation's lying about making charitable donations that they had not. He also broke the story on Trump's remarks made in the infamous Access Hollywood tape. More recently, he has reported on Trump's legal problems with the New York State judicial system as well. It's a nice discussion. Will be moderated by Mary Ann Ahern. Is that? Ahern, thank you. Mary is an Emmy-winning reporter who has worked for NBC5 Chicago since 1989. She became a political reporter for NBC in 2006 and has reported on many important aspects of political life, including breaking the Catholic priest sexual abuse scandal in Chicago in 1991. She has reported on elections within Chicago, Illinois, and around the nation throughout her career. Please join me in welcoming David Fahrenthold and Mary Ann
Ahern.
Ahern, sorry.
That's all right. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I don't want to miss you guys in the back. Hello, good to see you. So when they all first reached out to me and said, would I be available to come? And the two Davids, I was like, ooh, wow, I know this David, because I'm a huge follower on Twitter. And if you are any kind of follower on Twitter, you have to be following him. And so I said, whoa, yeah. And then when I heard that he was the honoree for the David Broder event, I said, double wow, because when I was covering the 2008 presidential campaign and hopping around and trying to keep track of where David was going to be, this David Axelrod, and of course trying to get the insight on then Senator Obama, I saw David Broder at the debates and at the various events, you know, whether it was the conventions, and I literally was like, whoa, that guy, there's the real deal. There is one smart dude. I read his reports all the time. I also knew that he had started in the Panagraph in Bloomington, downstate, and my first job was Peoria, Illinois, so how about that? We both got out, thank goodness. No offense to Peoria, but it was good to, you know, start there and move on. But yeah, so David Broder, whoa. I'm wondering, my first question to you is, who is that for you? Especially, you know, in today's polarized world, and it's so, you know, who do we follow and who's the real deal? Who is your person that when you might have seen over the last few years that you've said, yeah, I hope people, others read him or her?
That's a really good question. I mean, was David Broder at the beginning? I started at the Post when David Broder was still there. He was famous for his office, which was covered up to about the waistline with notes, like old notebooks, you know, or maybe even above. But also he was famous for the idea that, as David said, you can't cover politics from Washington. Washington, in some ways, is the worst place to cover politics from. You have to go out and find the voters where they are and be surprised by them. In terms of who has it been for me, so I just started this job at the Times, being an investigative reporter, trying to, you know, take longer with stories and to dig further into stories than I would have done in the past. The Times has some great investigative reporters, Eric Lipton, Mark Mazzetti, Adam Goldman. Part of the appeal was I wanted to sit next to those people. I want to be there, hear how they do it. Because I've spent a lot of time covering politics, and now moving out of politics, and there I learned from a lot of great political reporters. Now I want to be an investigative reporter, so I want to go where the talent is there, where I can learn the most, which has already been amazing. Just, you know, the Times had this story last week about how the U.S. had been giving intelligence to the Ukrainians to blow up the Russian ship and to blow up Russian generals. To hear them talking about that story before it came out, and the ethical questions about what do we reveal, you know, who said what, who's telling us not to publish the story. I feel like I've already learned so much just from a couple days in the office with them.
Wow, amazing. With so many students here who might be aspiring, I hope we haven't killed the journalist, you know, those out there that want to be a journalist. I know you think that journalism matters, but how has your work changed how we all get this story, because you have done it differently.
Well, the way I felt like covering, I didn't really do it differently for a long time, but then in 2016, I tried to embrace a new way of covering journalism, a new way of covering a story, which was to use social media and crowdsourcing. And that was only, like, I didn't come up with that idea one day. It was sort of forced upon me. It was desperation. I was writing about Trump, and particularly at that point, his promises to give to charity. Sid had given a lot of money to charity, first in the context of his political campaign. He, in particular, said he'd given $1 million out of his own pocket to a veterans charity. And I came into that as a political reporter, trying to just basically make sure that was true. So in a normal political campaign, so the story that I started out with was Trump says he gave $1 million to veterans. Who did he give it to? When did he give it? Why did he choose that group? I expected that would be a couple-day-long story. I thought I'd call them, they'd tell me the answer, we'd write about it. We'd learn something about Trump in the process. But of course, it was Trump. It wasn't a two-day story. They wouldn't tell me. And so I spent all this time trying to prove Trump right, to show that he'd done the thing that he'd already said he'd done. And he wouldn't help me. And then I realized I was in a place where all the things I'd learned as a journalist, all the traditional techniques were failing me because, he gave it to a charity someplace. How the hell am I going to find that, out of the millions of charities in America? And so I started asking on Twitter. I started sending out my queries to anybody that I thought might have gotten the money. Instead of doing it over email or with a phone call, I did it on Twitter because I wanted people to see what I was doing. And I was hoping to run into somebody that I didn't know I was looking for. My hope was somebody out there would say, hey, look, I saw you looking for this $1 million Trump gave away. You didn't ask me, but I got it. I saw you searching, so I'm going to volunteer myself. At the same time thinking, well, maybe Trump will see it, and if he didn't give the money, either he'll see we're not taking his bluff for an answer, and he'll either fess up where he gave the money or fess up that he didn't give the money. And after a couple days of searching for, using Twitter as a reporting tool, I'd gotten a lot of attention, but I'd learned nothing. I was like, this was a waste of time. I'm sorry I did this. But it turned out that Trump had seen it. And that night, Trump gave away the $1 million that he'd said he'd given away weeks before. So I realized the power in two ways. The power of social media to both help you find people that you didn't know how to find or you didn't even know you were looking for. And in his case, to make instead of the stonewalling being the end of the story, now the stonewalling is the story. Now I can show you how I'm being stonewalled and I'm trying to get around it. That doesn't work as well on every beat. It doesn't work as well on every story. But if there's times when you can use social media to sort of show how hard you're working to get to the truth and also give people a way to find you if they know the truth, it can be a really powerful tool.
And you went beyond that. I mean, you continued to expose, for instance, how often Trump used his own properties to hold events and how much money, therefore, then the government was paying to his hotels and to his resorts. And was that all done also by social media?
That was a real interesting hybrid because we were interested when Trump was president. Obviously, wherever the president goes, a whole bunch of people go whose meals and hotel rooms are paid for by the government. So we knew everybody knew he was going to Mar-a-Lago and to Trump Bedminster and all these other places all the time as president. And Eric Trump had said, well, whenever he does that, we basically give the government the rooms for free, or like the $50 a night or something. And so we wanted to check that. And so that started with a very traditional, reporting tool. I put in a Freedom of Information Act request, a FOIA request to the Secret Service. They were the ones who sort of, sent the most people with Trump. And after a while, we had to sue them at some point, but they did cough up these records. And so we started to get a sense of, how much money, every time Trump goes to his own property, how much money he was getting. But there was one element we couldn't get, which was the State Department. So Trump, if you guys may have blocked this out, but if you remember, Trump would have meetings with foreign dignitaries, the Premier of China, the Prime Minister of Japan, at Mar-a-Lago. And when you do that, even though you're still on American soil, the State Department pays. So they pay both for the foreign dignitaries, they pay for the flower arrangements, they pay for everything. And a bunch more people will go, like, presidential aides and State Department interpreters and things like that, and stay at the Trump property and pay Trump. But the State Department wasn't giving us anything. They wouldn't respond to FOIAs, they wouldn't respond to anything, so we sued them. We went through this long process where we, eventually, this is now in 2020, we're leading up to the election. Months after we filed the FOIA request, months after we sued them, The State Department said, okay, fine. We're going to give you the records you want, hundreds of pages. We're going to give them to you like 2 weeks before the election, like October 15th or something, 2020. So we said, well, that's not very much time before the election, but it's some time. So we'll get these records and we can write a story before the election. October 15, 2020 rolls around. They sent us 2 pages. And they're like, oh, sorry, we couldn't get around to it. And they said, but we'll give you a lot November 15th, 2 weeks after the election. You can have anything you want November 15th. And that, I thought, like, okay, well, I've done everything I can, the normal reporting path. I've even sued them, which not everybody has the money to do, and I'm still getting stonewalled. So I'm going to try social media again with low hopes because, I said, look, I asked for State Department records showing how much Trump had, the State Department spent at Trump properties. Didn't get them. They got stonewalled. Basically, they misled us. Can anybody help? Does anybody have these records? But like thinking, well, who the hell has these records? Like what is the universe of people who would have State Department records in hand ready to give out? But I was, again, had no other choice. Put that out there on Twitter. Within a few hours, we had hundreds of pages of records from a source. And so we were able to show that, like, Trump charged the government for the glass of water he drank when he was meeting with the Prime Minister of Japan. He charged for the flowers. We got that whole story because of crowdsourcing. So even in that situation where I thought, okay, the universe of people I'm aiming at is so small, it still worked.
How do you make sure that that person is the real deal, that is an accurate, good source? I'm thinking, wow, this sounds like Watergate when they met under the garage somewhere.
Totally.
Is this all done by email? I mean, you got to be able to trust who's giving you this.
Well, it's even harder in a pandemic because you'd have to be at opposite ends of the garage. But in that situation, yes, you're always wary that when people reach out to you over. So when people do reach out over social media and say, hey, you asked for this, here, I have the documents. You have to treat it like, there's no special trust you put in that because it came in over Twitter. You have to treat it like any other source, which is you have to find ways of verifying it. You have to understand who the person was. You have to understand, okay, would this be a person that would really have access to this information? Can I trust it? Does it match things we already know? For instance, like, does it match the room rates that we know Trump charges at Mar-a-Lago, $650 a night for each room? Like, does it match other things we know? And in that case, it did, and we knew the source and knew this was a person who would have access to these records.
And does that take a day, a week? How long is all that?
It depends. Sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes you get stuff you can never use because you can never be totally sure it was legitimate. In that case, the source was good enough that we knew pretty much right away what it was. But then it just took a long time to go through all the information, make sense of it, and write the story. Just as an aside, like, there have been times when people have tried to hoax us. I mean, one good example from 2016, another reporter called me and said, look, we just got a call from somebody who said, that they were Trump's secretary back in the day, and that Trump said all these horrible anti-Semitic things, and they want to meet us at the Starbucks, and they'll tell us. And he's like, I'm going to go over there and meet them. My co-reporter, my fellow reporter had talked to this person. He's like, I'm going to go over there and meet them, but, to me, just be on standby in case this is something we want to cover. Be ready to jump in if this is legit. So he goes, and this is good advice for any journalist in the audience. He got there 10 minutes early, which is a good idea in this case, because he's sitting there at the Starbucks waiting around, and somebody taps him on the shoulder and said, listen, I need you to leave this seat. I need you to move from this seat. And he's like, why? He's like, the Washington Post is coming in 10 minutes, and we're going to trick them, and I need my friend who has a camera needs to sit at this seat so they can get it. And so Ben, the other reporter, left after that and called me. He's like, what should I do? He's like, should I go back there and confront them? I was like, if you go back and confront them, you'll be on video, but he did it anyway.
Yeah.
So there's certainly that the hoaxes do come over the transom. In my experience, the problem was much more likely to be that people didn't have what they thought they had, or didn't have exactly what I needed. I found very few cases where it seemed like people were doing it to be malicious.
Okay. You also were the first that had the video of Trump talking about groping women. I don't want to say the exact words because it's pretty awful, but, some thought that was going to really change the whole turn of events of him getting elected. It didn't change it, but it still is in a lot of people's minds, and certainly I remembered it. How did you get that?
That I can't tell you. It's a great story, but I can't tell you. But yeah, I thought it was. I don't know. At that point, that I had sort of changed the. Obviously, if that videotape had come out about Mitt Romney in 2012, it would have ended his career. But Trump obviously had conditioned people to accept lots of bad things about him, and people cared. People liked him anyway. So I didn't, the expectation when that story came in was not like, oh, Donald Trump is done. It was not when we did it, obviously, and it was not the expectation that we'd taken Donald Trump out. If the timing of that and the James Comey letter had been reversed, the election might have turned out differently, but I didn't go into it thinking that I had just sealed the election, and that was not the point of it.
All right, so President Trump, fake news, something we hadn't really heard of before, that constant complaint. Do you think there's a shift today with the Biden administration? Are they more accessible?
Accessible. I don't deal with them that much, so I feel like I'm not a great barometer of that. I do feel like they sort of regard the press in the way that every other, broadly in the way that every other administration before Trump did, which is like, they want to be covered by us. They want us to cover them accurately. If they're Democrats, they feel like we're not nice enough to them. Republicans feel the same way. Yeah. But they are, I think, normal in that way. I don't know if they're great or terrible, but they're not Trump. I mean, Trump was really an anomaly that they have gone back from that.
All right. Interesting to hear. Now you're at the New York Times. Wow. And tell us, I want to know a little more about a couple of the stories. You say you have more time, but my goodness, I've already
written 3 stories in 3 months. It's incredible.
I know. I'm like, you're not taking the, I'm going to have 6 months to work on this kind of routine. The investigative guys, even in TV news, were all like, what are they doing today? I'm doing 2 stories. What are they doing? They're thinking big thoughts, like, wait a minute. One of the stories you did, Crime Stoppers in Houston. Okay, so Crime Stoppers, I have literally hosted. I've been the MC before at the Crime Stoppers dinner, trying to be out there helping out some kind of nonpartisan, supposedly non-political group. But little did I know, in Houston, they were condemning more than a dozen elected judges, all of them Democrats, and their budget relied on...
Same judges. That was so I grew up in Houston. Crime Stoppers is a bigger deal there than it is anywhere else. Like Crime Stoppers is the end of every TV news segment. The TV news used to stage reenactments for them. Like they would reenact crimes for people to draw attention to Crime Stoppers. They have their own building. They have millions of dollars. But this is I wanted to switch to this nonprofit beat, and this is why. This is exactly why. Because people automatically trust what nonprofits do without understanding that nonprofits are made up of humans and nonprofits have financial motivations. And in this case, what it turned out had happened was Crime Stoppers made a classic mistake in the nonprofit world, which is they had a ton of money and they decided they wanted a building. So they have a staff of 12. They bought an entire city block, tore a building down, and built a 3-story headquarters for their staff of 12, spending $12 million. Which they did not have, which they expected they could raise, but then couldn't. So they went from surpluses and black in the black to in the red, needing a loan. And so in that moment, they did 2 things. One, they turned to Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, a Republican. He gave them a $4 million grant, which saved their bacon, kept them, that was a huge amount of the money they needed for that year. And they listed him as anonymous in their list of donors. He did it with public money, but he was anonymous. After that, they began supporting Greg Abbott, praising him. They'd never been partisan before in any way. They start praising Greg Abbott, talking about what a great guy he is. At the same time, they depend on judges. So Texas, does Illinois elect judges?
Yes.
It's a terrible system. No one should ever do it. But Texas does also. And the Crime Stoppers' source of income, one of its biggest source of income, was that judges could make probationers, as a condition of their probation, pay Crime Stoppers $50. Even if Crime Stoppers didn't catch you, whatever, you have to pay $50 to Crime Stoppers to get out of jail. So they lived for a while on this stream of income that they had to do no work to get. The judges would make involuntary donors give them this money. So 2018, the Beto wave in Texas, obviously Beto doesn't get elected, but in Harris County, Houston, changes everything. They wipe out all the Republican judges. Suddenly there's all these Democratic judges, many of them very liberal. And so many of them stop making the probationers pay the $50 fee to Crime Stoppers. Crime Stoppers loses, at the same time it's put itself in this financial hole, they lose this reliable source of involuntary donations. And so their solution was to go on television and attack individual judges by name. Judge Chris Morton of the 185th District Court is letting criminals out to kill again without ever telling people, we have a financial incentive in this guy losing. If he loses, we make more money. Understanding that, like that financial relationship to their rhetoric makes you understand much more where they're coming from, or maybe why they've chosen this path. Which, as a Houstonian, as somebody who loved that institution, covered it, thought it was the most trusted institution in the world, it was a fascinating look inside.
And has local media hopped on it too? And what's going on?
So their local television media there is very close to Crime Stoppers. So some of them have jumped in to attack us. Some of them have asked questions. It's been really interesting to see the fallout from it. I don't know how it's affected Crime Stoppers. Certainly, they have not repented of their secret partisanship. They seem to have continued on and being a very political organization. But yeah, that's a case where I didn't write that story thinking that they would change or they had to change. But if you're someone in Houston who sees this group and sees it through the eyes of 40 years of trust and 40 years of solving crimes, you're missing something, and I wanted to tell you what that was.
And was that the motivation or did someone reach out to you and say, you gotta come back here? You're from
totally.
Here, and you know this is not true.
That's what happened. The first day at the Times, I tweeted out, like, hey, I'm looking for stories about nonprofits, places where people are using nonprofits to hide fraud, power plays, partisanship, whatever. And I got like 700 responses from people all over the country. Some of them were like, you should investigate my brother-in-law. He runs a foundation. But a lot of them were about really fascinating groups that have huge, I'm still obviously like working my way through some of the really good tips that came out of that. But this was one of them. And I teamed up with a reporter from the Marshall Project, Carrie Blakinger, who knew Houston really well. So that was a real luxury to get to go back to my hometown with somebody who actually knew it.
Wow. I still can't get over how you have used social media to your... Do you think anyone else in the country does it as much as you do and have had such a success?
I don't know. I mean, I think... I don't know. It's a good question. I don't want to say nobody does it as well as I do, because I'm sure there are people who do it better. It's just... The thing that I've found is that it's you have to be sure you're using it in the right way. Yeah. And that means, like, I don't put all my reporting out on Twitter. I don't tell you what I'm searching for if I don't, I don't want to be in a position of like asking a question on Twitter where it turns out I've like cast aspersions on somebody who's innocent, right?
Okay.
There are times when you can show people the steps that you're taking in your reporting, but that's only a certain kind of story. Like the Trump story was ideal for that because he'd already made a claim. And I'm just saying, like, here I am trying to prove this claim is true. But the using it as a way to get in ideas, especially on a beat like this, where like there's so many millions of nonprofits, you could spend a whole year just sort of learning that world. To have a way to put it out there that I'm interested in these stories and have stuff come in, it's such a luxury. It makes me look so much smarter than I am, that I have all these people sort of doing my legwork for me.
Yeah, it's like having, the Globe is your newsroom kind of thing, yeah.
I mean, and you don't realize, one of the things that I learned in this process is that the readers know so much more than I do about any topic, even a topic like Trump that I consider myself an expert on. Readers know so much more than I do, and that often you find things you aren't even looking for. Just as one example from the Trump beat, when I was writing about Trump's charity, the Trump Foundation, one of the mysteries that I was trying to solve back in 2016 was the smallest donation in the history of the Trump Foundation. He gave a $7 gift $7 grant to the Boy Scouts in like 1989. So, you see that on the list of donations, $7 to the Boy Scouts from a billionaire. There's got to be a story there, right? But I had thought, well, there's no way in hell I'm ever going to find out what that story is. It's 1989, so long ago. The Boy Scouts won't talk to me. Trump won't talk to me. Like, I don't even really know where to start looking to find what this was. And so I put it on Twitter just as like, not like, hey, I need your help, but more like, there must be a good story here, but I'm never going to be able to find it. It's lost in the mist of history. Just like, let's all enjoy this mystery together. And somebody out there started doing something that I had not thought of, which was he started going back and looking at digitized ads from newspapers in New York in 1989, and he found one that said, and it was amazing to watch this happen. Like, I'm in a cab or something watching all this happening, with people like doing all this work that I had never thought to do. And they were like, well, maybe it was the popcorn. If some of you were Boy Scouts way back when, they used to make us sell popcorn. It was the world's worst popcorn. It popped several years earlier. It held no candle. People bought it out of guilt, basically. Was it the popcorn? But no, the popcorn, like they tweeted like at Trails End popcorn, I think it's called. How much did popcorn cost in 1989? No, that was like $5. It doesn't fit. So then somebody found a digitized ad that says, enroll your son, this is like the fall of 1989, enroll your son in the Boy Scouts today in New York. Registration is only $7. And it was the year Donald Jr. turned 11, or whatever year you can join the Boy Scouts. So Donald Trump used the charity's money to pay his son's $7 entrance fee to the Boy Scouts. Like that tells you so much more about him than, almost anything. And that would only have been found if I only found that because I asked for help that way.
Wow, and you've done even some more work on the status of his businesses today. What's going on?
Well, when he was elected president, the Trump Foundation basically went away. It eventually closed down after a lawsuit from the New York Attorney General. So then we started covering his businesses. And that meant trying to find news sources. People, the idea was Trump had always made it so the only person who could tell you about his businesses was him. They're not public companies. They put out very little. Like they have a spokesperson, but she never speaks. There's not really like a independent set of facts out there about the Trump organization that you can turn to. It was just him, and so he could say whatever he wanted about his business, and usually there was nobody there to fact check him. And so we wanted to try to find, let's try to look inside the black box. And usually that meant finding people who had, they couldn't see the whole picture. I mean, it would have loved to have somebody who could see the whole picture, but I'm looking for somebody who can see just a little bit of, their piece of what's inside there. But that gives me a view in that I wouldn't have otherwise before. So that meant, golf club members, investors in Trump's hotels, local governments that handled Trump properties and might have some sort of records of their interactions with him. We spent so much time compiling hundreds and hundreds, thousands and thousands of names of people who might have some sort of knowledge, and then just mass emailing all of them or calling all of them to try to find. And the response rate was 1 in 100. Trump's hotel in Chicago, the individual hotel rooms are sold off. So you might stay in room 1845. And it looks like every other room to you, but it's actually owned by, Joe Smith and Cicero. We're trying to find Joe Smith because he gets a little bit of information about how his room is doing and how the whole hotel is doing. And so we emailed hundreds of people, and 5 of them wrote back. But those 5 knew a lot, and they knew something that we could only get from them. So building that kind of set of sources, one little bit at a time, I can see a little bit about this property and a little bit about that property. Can I compare them? That was an extremely tedious process, but there was no, it was a case where because that company is so closed off, any little bit of actual verifiable fact is something to celebrate. So we spent a long time building that up. And then, of course, he got into social media, and so, my knowledge about golf courses became less important. But yes, that was while he was president, we wanted to know, was he using the presidency to benefit his business, or the other way around, where his business is hurting in a way that would affect his use of power? Was he, because he saw 2 halves of the world, and the public only saw half of that. We saw the public half, but he also saw that and what was happening with his business. And so if we don't understand this half of it, we can't understand really how he sees the world. That was the idea, which we did with varying degrees of success. The New York Times actually got his tax returns, and so the Times actually got a lot of, by looking further into the past, got a lot of stuff that we didn't get.
And haven't you reported recently that the status today is that he's gone back to some of those donors to help prop him up?
Yeah, and he also went, he has this new social media company, and a lot of it, he's gone back to, so yes, since he's gotten out of office, he's gone back to lenders that helped him, refinance his loan on Trump Tower in New York. He's used his own campaign to support his businesses. The Saudis are supporting his businesses by holding a big golf tournament at Trump Bedminster and Trump Doral. And he's got a lot of his friends investing in this new Truth Social, his new social media app. So yes, the political campaign connections he made are now sustaining him in his business. I mean, even talking to people who belong to Trump Bedminster, I mean, it's there's MAGA hats around the pool now where there didn't used to be. So, the politics have sustained the business and replaced the people that he drove out with his politics.
And today, Elon Musk says that Trump will be reinstated to Twitter should Elon Musk, all of this go through. What do you think about that?
I thought about that. So I have a Tesla. And we discovered the other day, I was sitting with my daughter in the car. We were waiting for my other daughter to come out of a party. So my Tesla, it's a great car. It also, we discovered by messing around on the touchscreen, it will make farting noises. I can make it fart loudly. Like it produces internal and external fart noises. So someone at Tesla spent time coding and engineering like a fart machine. And I think of that, like that to me is a great metaphor for Elon Musk. Like he's in some ways like a visionary business leader, but also like an 11-year-old with, and I don't know which half of him will run Twitter, but it seems like the 11-year-old is, So I don't know what Twitter's going to be like then. I already feel like I am using Twitter much less than I was, just because I feel like it gives you a warped view of the world. It gives you a warped view of who your audience is. It's the people that I interact with on Twitter are great in a lot of ways, but I can't use them as a proxy for the audience for my stories because they're much more political, much more informed. They're much more tied to New York and Washington. So I've already tried to use it a lot, use it when I need it, but not to use it all the time, not to have it be the way that I see the world. And I imagine if Elon Musk gets control of Twitter and sort of opens undoes all the things that they had done to make it a less abusive, less, less full of disinformation, I imagine I'll use it less.
And there are those who are concerned that if Trump is back on Twitter, that he will increase the likelihood of political violence. Is that going too far?
Well, I mean, Twitter obviously is not Trump's only tool. He has a lot of other tools. He has his own theoretical social network he could use. Obviously, we can look at the past and see that what Trump did after the 2020 election led to violence, led to people, both on Twitter and other forums, it led to people storming the Capitol. So I do worry about that, but I don't think that, Twitter is the only way Trump could get that message out, or is getting that message out.
All right, let's go also to what you've been working on most recently. This past weekend, the United Nations, a top UN official was forced to resign within hours of your
3 or 4 hours,
of your story being posted. Explain what happened. It's the UN Office for Project Services.
So this was such a fun story about the UN. So the UN to me is like Congress. There's great stories there, but I wouldn't want to cover it every day. I did cover Congress every day, and covering its actual business is terrible. Covering its scandals is amazing. So the UN, in this case, there's a UN agency, a very obscure UN agency, that found itself with a lot of extra money. Their job normally was they were sort of like a general contractor for the UN. So if you needed to build a road, you needed to build a schools, you needed to clean up a minefield, they were good at that. But there was no prestige in that in the UN. In the UN, the prestige comes from standing at a podium, giving out money, and they were sort of like downstream from that. And so the leaders of this group ended up with a bunch of money. They made money by charging other UN agencies to do their work for them. And they charged way too much and stockpiled like $100 million. And they said, okay, well, now we're going to stand at the podium. We're going to give out the money. We're going to be a bank. We're going to start loaning money out. We're going to do something the UN has never done. Which sounded like a great idea in theory, but then they met a guy at a party and they gave all the money to him. They met a guy at a party and they loaned his company $58 million. And they gave his daughter, on top of that, they gave his 23-year-old daughter $3 million to produce a pop song about the ocean. So it was just the quintessential, how do you spend money when it's not your money, right? So these people, they had a big pile of money that they could do anything they wanted to with, and they confidently gave it to this guy. And now, of the $58 million they gave him, at least $22 million is gone. Apparently, some of it he used to pay off other debts that he had to other people. So he took the UN's loan and used it to pay loans he already had to other people. And so just unraveling that and trying to it was sort of like covering, there was some elements that were familiar to me from covering the government, the U.S. government, and that people were like, oh, it's bad, but nothing can be done about it, right? This is just how things are. And it took a while to sort of unravel enough that you could tell the story in a way that a regular person could understand, and you could break through sort of the UN jargon. We were lucky that there were some great characters in here. One of the great characters was, this sort of brought me back to my Trump roots. The guy who introduced the UN to the guy who now has their money was the same person who introduced Donald Trump to Melania Trump back in the day. An Italian,
the chances of that.
Yeah, exactly. An Italian man about town. It was I was telling the students earlier that one of the most amazing reporting experiences we ever had was we're trying to establish that they met this guy at a party. That was like a key detail, that they met this person at a party. But we couldn't figure out what party or when. So we think we know the party. But we're like, okay, well, how do you prove two people met at a party in 2015? And if you can, how do you prove that was the first time they met? So I was a little dubious we would ever be able to do that. And then we got a photo of them at this party. Thankfully, the UN has lots of like party photographers. We got a photo of them at the party in which the UN official was holding his business card and like facing it toward the camera so you can see. So like that I was like, okay, well, that's how you know. That's a photo that actually shows people are meeting for the first time.
Wow.
Yeah, so a few hours, the UN basically, a few hours after our story ran, the head of that agency who had been sort of holding out was forced to resign. So there could be more there. We don't know yet if it was corruption or just like massive incompetence. But it was an amazing story to learn. Like, wow, this tells you so much about the way the UN works in the context of a story that's fun to read.
Well, and I even read in the comments in your Twitter feed today of this story, which I thought was interesting. Someone said, people have gone to jail for a lot less. Might that happen?
It certainly might. The UN is a place that is, one of the reasons this happens is the UN is basically outside of normal accountability. So there's no police, there's no prosecutors. There's been an investigation into what happened, but the investigation is over and they just haven't told us what's going on. They don't have to tell you the result of the investigation. So it could be that the people who ran this UN office could be referred for prosecution, but the UN Secretary General would have to sort of strip them of their immunity for that to happen first. So it could happen, but it hasn't happened yet.
All right, so where do you think we all stand in the future of journalism? You know, there are just so many sources, so many places you can go today. And I fear that some don't know the difference between Facebook and the New York Times. I know the people in here know that, but a lot of people out there do not know the difference.
Yeah.
How do we convey that? And how do we also convey to students that the good old-fashioned legwork still, maybe it's done on Twitter today, but it still is what it takes to get a good story?
Well, I obviously worry, like all of us do, about people who turn to Facebook or Twitter and read something that they want to be true and then treat that as the news rather than reading it in a place like the Washington Post or the New York Times that works hard to make sure that we're telling you the truth. So obviously I don't run Facebook, and so I can't control what they do. But I try to think, like, what can I do that makes, will help if people happen upon my story. That part, if they happen on it, I can't control that much. But if they do, what can I do with my story or my tweets to make you understand the value of what I've done? And so a couple ways. One is on Twitter, on social media, I try to do as much as I can to show you how hard I worked to get this story. How much, these are all the steps I took to get this. This is all the work that went into it. If possible, to show you while I'm doing it, so you can have more trust in this. Like, oh, that's the guy. Back in 2016, I posted a lot of photos of my notebook as I went down this list trying to track down Trump's donations because it looks like work. You look at it and you go, okay, that guy's working. He's trying to find the answer
100%.
here.
That's how
Yeah.
You did a lot on the Trump Hotel here in Chicago.
Yeah, I did.
I was like, who is this guy?
Yeah.
I need to follow him.
Right, 'cause otherwise, like if you're a reader, and you're interested in my topic, like my stories appear at what seem to be random intervals. You don't know when I'm going to write one. And then they could be long, they could be short. You don't know how to, even if you're interested, how do I give you a place where you can watch this space and you'll be caught up. So social media is valuable for that. I can show you the reporting I'm doing. I can tell you the reporting I did after it's over. The other thing is about the stories themselves. And I'm really conscious of the fact that, we used to believe back in the old days when we were just writing for print, there was so much focus on what we called the kicker, which was the last line in a story. We just put so much effort into like, am I going to write a great little last line? And then the internet came along, and we could see that nobody read the last line. They all had stopped reading long before they got to this thing that I put so much effort into. And so how should that change the way which is probably the case always. Like people were never reading that line, but we didn't know. So how does that change the way that we write stories? Well, I think, one, the stories have to be longer, maybe shorter, but also, like, we have to think about, am I creating off-ramps in my story because I'm trying to do an artful turn of phrase or because I think this little aside is interesting? Am I giving you a paragraph, we've all done this. I've done this, obviously, as a reader of a story, as you go down the story where you go, okay, I'm done. And if I give you that off-ramp in the 5th paragraph, it doesn't matter what's in the 10th paragraph, you're gone. So is there a way to write stories in a way that's simpler, it's easier to understand, it's maybe not as artful or as sort of artistic, but that keeps your attention, keeps you moving? For reporters, people who want to be reporters, there's a book I really recommend called Writing Tools by Roy Peter Clark, who talks about this. Like, put something interesting in every paragraph. Give me something like a capital letter, interesting detail in every paragraph. He calls them gold coins, because otherwise people are leaving. The Post had an editor who was the opposite approach of that. He wanted every paragraph to be about 100 words long and in a giant square. There'd be no capital letters in it. Your eye couldn't even read it. Like, I wrote the story and I can't read the thing that he put in there. You have to think about, can you keep people's attention, and are you giving them ways to leave your story? And if so, how can you change that? I think that has to change the way we write, because you don't want people to leave the story that you worked so hard on before they get to the stuff you found.
And how much do you see today, journalism, of the intersection of broadcast and print and the internet? How much you really cannot just be this investigative reporter who is writing your solo article, because if you're not conveying it as you do so well here today, who's going to be interested? Who's going to know who you are? All of that. I mean, there's just so much more of an intersection.
Oh, totally. I mean, I love being on television because it's a whole new set of people that didn't, you can point to your story. I used to tell the Post people when I was writing about Trump, I want to be on the radio. You put me on the radio wherever. I want to be on radio stations, not obviously the big cities, but you put me on the radio in Des Moines, Baton Rouge, wherever, because I want people that don't read the Washington Post every day to hear about this and have a reason to go check it out. And also because I think it's helpful in those things too, to hear the questions people have. If you go on call-in radio shows, the questions that listeners have are often things that you think are obvious or you would never think to ask. It just lets you see what a real reader thinks and wants to know. But I think that's great, to try to find as many new audiences as I can everywhere. The danger, I think, is the pressure to be pundits. There were times on television when I was asked to opine about the health care bill or repeal of Obamacare or whatever, and I would say I don't know anything about that. And they would be like, that's fine, come on anyway. And I think that's really dangerous, both because it's boring, but also because I think there's a real sense among some people in D.C. that the highest form of journalism is punditry. Basically, that you're a journalist so you can figure out how Washington works, and then you can become a pundit and you can predict things. That's the highest level, is to go on television and say, well, the next thing that's going to happen is this. That's so, it was probably never that useful, but now when we've seen so much has changed, and the idea that because you covered something that happened in 2008, that it's going to happen the same way now, you can't rely on that at all. And in fact, your belief that you know how Washington works may blind you to the fact that it's working differently. So I think that's the one thing that I would like to change about television, is the sort of, and print journalism too, the idea that what we're really out there to do is to predict what's going to happen next, when I feel like that is such a fool's errand. It always was, but especially now. Right.
Okay, tell us, you've been to both of the major papers, the Post and the New York Times. How are they different? How are they alike? Obviously you like where you are, but is there something you might miss from the Post? What is that like?
So as a funny aside, one thing that I've noticed that's different about the Times is the focus on contractions, or I wrote my story once and I got an angry, or a scolding call from my editor who was like, there's a place in the New York Times for hadn't and can't, but not in this story. It's too serious. It's got to be had not and cannot.
Oh my.
Oh,
that's interesting.
That's the one difference, is the contractions. But they're actually a lot alike. The Times is a bigger institution and has more. Basically, the Times is like the Post was when I first started in 2000. The Post was a big place. It had always been big. There were lots of in-house experts, and a sense that whatever you were doing, someone had already done it before, and there was a manual for how you should do it. And then the Post had a lot of really lean years where we got small, and we lost a lot of people because we were really dependent on a local print-based advertising model that didn't work. And so then a lot of that in-house expertise was lost. And the Post then, after Jeff Bezos bought the Post in 2013, has been rebuilding that from a much lower base and discovering ambitions beyond what we used to be. So the Post there was much more a sense that you were reinventing the wheel as it went along, which was great. The thing that I did, using social media to report in 2016, I didn't have to ask anybody at the Post. I just started doing it, and then they were happy. But there was no person I needed to check with. It was much more freewheeling. The Times, it feels like it's a big institution where there's a structure that people understand. There's lots of in-house experts. There might be less room to experiment. I don't know yet, but it feels much more like the Post did when I got there. For this story about the UN, we needed to know how much it costs to write a song. So this charity got paid $3 million to produce a song. Like, is that a lot or a little? I don't know. So the Times has a business of music reporter. And I found him, I called him up, and he was like, oh, well, I know all about how much songs cost. Like, I'll give you people to talk to. Like, to have that kind of expertise in-house is really cool.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
okay, so 5 years ago, you won the Pulitzer. This is the week they announced them. Obviously, yesterday, the Tribune, many other places, people are very thrilled about their awards. How has that, when people say your name, Pulitzer Prize, like right out, it's sort of, is that an awesome responsibility? I mean, or is it just, obviously it's changed your career, I would think.
Yo, definitely. I mean, it does change your career. I mean, it gives people, it gives you this sense, gives you sort of a shorthand that people outside the world of journalism know that you've done something that they're interested in, know you've done something that they've heard of. I don't know. For me, I think covering Trump and Access Hollywood was probably a bigger deal. Like, that was such a huge news story at the time that it probably, that gave me more of a platform.
How many more Twitter followers then?
Oh, I mean, I started out the Trump coverage with 7,000, and I have 845,000 now. But that I think changed my life more than the Pulitzer. One funny story. But the day of the Pulitzers were announced, my daughter, who's now 10, was, she was 5 then. She was standing next to me in the newsroom. She had this beautiful blue sequin dress on, and when they announced that you've won, everybody started clapping, and it kind of scared her. So I was holding on to her in the picture, and she was holding a little reporter's notebook, and that was on the front page of the Post. And it was such a inspiration because Alexandra, who saw that, she knew that she was a celebrity. Obviously, everybody had seen her picture, but she was determined to wear it as lightly as possible, to be as cool as she could. People knew what she knew. When she walked down the street, people knew her, but she wasn't going to make a big deal out of it. Once we went to North Carolina to go to watch a basketball game, and we were in Raleigh, North Carolina, and she looked at me, this is a year later, and she was like, Daddy, the people here probably don't know me because they don't read the Washington Post. So I don't know. I've tried to be. If I got any celebrity out of that, I tried to be to wear it as lightly as Alexandra did.
Well, in researching for today, I did watch that video of when they gave you the award there in the newsroom, and I always think that is the coolest thing, how everybody gathers around, and Marty Barron, who had been in Chicago, was there, and he referred to your mother, and, as a mom of 3, I just thought, oh, gosh, I love how moms still get some, credit that they've been waiting for,
It's a little like your wedding or something, and that you get to gather everybody that you've ever known together, and you can thank people. It was a really funny occasion.
Yeah.
My mother, so I have 2 kids, and my older daughter was with me. My younger daughter was only 1.5 at the time, so my mother was holding her. And Stella, the little one, got hungry during the process, and my mother was feeding her a banana. And one of the pictures, this beautiful picture of us all in the newsroom, you can see my mother holding a banana in the background. You can't see the baby. It just looks like a woman in the background holding up a banana. So we have that framed someplace.
Oh, gosh, that's great. Well, I think it's a good time perhaps to transition into questions from everybody that's here. If you all have some, the mic is over here on this side. If you don't mind walking over to the mic, or she'll come to you if you raise your hand so that we can get some of you also engaged. There has to be some questions. Oh, over here, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ewan. I'm a third year in college. So my question is actually for both of you, Marianne, if you also like to answer. So I think we heard a lot of fascinating stories of how we do investigative journalism. I think a lot of that depends on resources that outlets like New York Times and the Washington Post provides, the networks like your social media followers, obviously. I'm wondering, what does that mean for local journalism? And are we seeing a future of journalism where local news is going to become more dominated by those, national news outlets, and we're seeing less independent newsrooms?
Well, I could start with, I think we have all gone, we're an industry like any other. There's peaks and valleys, of course. There's cuts, and then they come back and say, guess what? We had a big investigative unit, now we have a smaller one. But I do see a commitment. I've been there a long time, but I do see a commitment to politics. There's certain beats in Chicago that are just sort of, there's no way. Sports and politics, that people care about. They want to know what's going on. And so I feel, while I might not have a bunch of researchers to help me, recently the photographer editor that I work with, that is, he's sort of my lifeline. The previous one left, and I went to the news director and said, oh my God, you know, this is key. During the pandemic, we used to work with whoever, but during the pandemic, we worked with one person so that if one of us got sick, we didn't infect the whole newsroom. So he said, well, I got a surprise for you. Mike McGovern wants to work with you. I nearly cried. I mean, this is a guy that's gone to the Olympics. This is a guy who today, now after doing this for 2 years with me, says every single day, as I left tonight, what do we have for tomorrow? What's on for tomorrow? I mean, that's like craziness, honestly. A lot of people could care less. You know, they've done it 100 times, you know, whatever. Who cares who's in town? The president's in town tomorrow, actually. Biden's in town. And, you know, Mike wants to know, where are we going to be? What do I need? Well, that kind of stuff. So I don't have the resources to call up the music business person, you know, to call and ask a question to. But I do have the ear and the back of people in the newsroom that when I do raise my hand and say, oh my gosh, we're planning a Republican debate coming up soon for the governor's 6 candidates in Illinois. And they're pulling out the people for me to lean on, which I need. So you know, there's always, you know, you always want more. You know, you always want to have. I wish I had an intern all the time. I wish I had someone next to me that could help write the web story when I'm doing the broadcast story. You know, I'm sitting there later at night still handing that one in. But I do see in Chicago is a big journalism town, and they care about TV journalism. It is not LA, where it's, you know, sort of the stars and the Access Hollywood, whatever. So that's my positive spin, but it is the truth.
I've been really heartened by the rise of nonprofit news outlets like the Texas Tribune, ProPublica, places like that that have done really good, you know, investigative stories and partnered with local journalism, local newsrooms to have a platform to put them out. So, I mean, I think hopefully the sort of approach to investigative journalism, starting with documents, moving to people, like that is something that can be done on a, you know, long time horizon or a short time horizon and by people anywhere. But I do worry that the business model of local journalism makes it harder for people to do it, even just regular beat reporting, much less long-term projects in a lot of places.
Can I mention Black Club Chicago, which you probably
so
have
good.
heard of? I mean, they've just been amazing. This startup that is, you know, if you're not following them as well. I mean, last year during the pandemic and the distribution of the vaccine, they started with the story of how this little hospital on the west side, which was a safety net hospital, was supposed to be targeting their vaccines only to the people either that worked at the hospital or the neighborhood. Well, it turned out one of the doctors was taking it to the Gold Coast, to a restaurant, to a jewelry store, to the Trump Hotel. And, you know, so they have become, you know, and we credit them, obviously, but you see that in Block Club and you go, okay, wait a second, I need to be making some calls on this.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah. Anybody else? Any other questions? Yeah.
Sam Charles, I work in the news here in Chicago.
Hey.
Super big fan of yours.
Thank you.
So no doubt you're crazy well sourced. How do you prioritize which story gets your attention right now? And like what goes on the back burner for a later time?
And he does an amazing job. Sam Charles, you all should be reading him as well. It's the truth.
I mean, that was a harder thing with Trump because there were always like, you know, short-term things and long-term things. Now that I'm on the nonprofit beat, like everything is a little more long-term. For me, it's been, I have a really good editor that I sort of go to with a list of stories, and I'm just like, okay, you know, here's what I think I'm going to do, and he'll say, I like that, I don't like that, you know, put this on the back burner. So I think that's been, basically, I find it so hard when I'm on a beat. I'm so close to it that sometimes I have trouble determining like what would be surprising to somebody who's doesn't know as much as I do. And so then you need somebody like a friend at work or an editor that you can say like, you know, that you can talk to about your work and have them say like, oh, that's the story, not this other stuff. You also I feel like I tend to prioritize things that were harder for me to get, even if they were not the most important thing. Like if I had to really sweat and struggle to get this thing, I want to make that the lead. I want to make that the story. And you need somebody to be like, no, it's not that, you know, that was hard to get, but it's not that important. This other thing that was easy to get is the more important thing. So I find that it's hard for me to make that judgment myself. So you need somebody to bounce that stuff off.
Hi, Michael Glotzer. I'm faculty in biology here. My question is sort of inspired by this Twitter thread by Steve Schmidt over the last couple of days about Rick Davis and Oleg Deripaska back in 2008. Seems like the investment of Russia into our political system is even deeper than we thought. Is that a area you plan to dig into more, or?
Well, so at the Post.
Explain it to those who don't know.
Well, so Steve Schmidt was an advisor to the McCain campaign in 2008. I've been a Republican campaign person for a long time. I guess I had seen where he was fighting with other people. I didn't see the part about Oleg Deripaska, but I guess he's saying that a Russian oligarch was investing in U.S. politics that far back. I sat next to the people at the Post who did that. She really had like a stereotypical kind of crazy map on the wall of all the different connections between different people. It's a huge, that work was tremendously difficult because there were so many people whose relationships with Putin and with the Russian government were on purpose opaque. So I know it's been done a lot by the Post and the Times. It's not something that I've ever done. It may be something that I get into in the future. But I would always look at that and think like that. It's such a frustrating job in many ways because it was so much work to establish just the basic things happen. These people knew these people gave this order. And often she was in the position of writing about somebody who would then become super important 6 months later. She'd write a story about Konstantin Kalimnik, and everyone would go, who the hell was that? And then 6 months later, he'd show up in the Trump impeachment. So she was ahead of her time in a way that did not produce a lot of web traffic at the time she wrote the stories. So those stories are really hard, and I'm glad people do them, but I have not done that much on them so far, at least.
Hi, my name's Dave Komanecki. Do you think the Walter Duranty Pulitzer should be rescinded, and would that be a good or a bad precedent?
So this is a fascinating story. So the Times in 1933, the New York Times correspondent in Moscow won a Pulitzer for international reporting. Turned out, this was at a time when there was almost under Stalin, there was very little other news coming out of Russia. Basically, people were really reliant on a small number of foreign journalists, of which this Walter Duranty was the the sort of most prominent for any news about Russia. And this guy Duranty loved Stalin. Well, everything he wrote was about how great Stalin was. Stalin was the leader that Russia needed at the moment. You couldn't judge Stalin by Western standards. The reports of a famine in Ukraine were, really millions of people died, were, overblown. Everybody had enough to eat. And so the question was, should he have his Pulitzer revoked? I don't want to give my opinion about it because I haven't read it enough to really have a valuable opinion. It does seem like something that, I guess the Times' argument is that, by leaving it on the record, we own it and own the failure, and we don't want to whitewash it. We don't want to eliminate it. We want to contextualize and tell people that this was a horrible thing and the things he was writing didn't reflect the truth, but eliminating it disappears it from the record. I feel like I don't know enough to offer an opinion either way, but I'm glad people have brought this up, and I do feel like there should be some way that if you're a casual observer, you should know when you come to that page in the Pulitzers, maybe you do, I haven't looked at it recently, that the stuff this guy was writing was not true. The closest parallel to this, I think, was the Janet Cook story in the Washington Post. I forget whether it was the late 80s or the early 90s. A Washington Post Metro reporter wrote that she had discovered, the stories were called Jimmy's World. She discovered an 8-year-old boy who was addicted to heroin, and she wrote all these stories about, maybe it should have been one story, but she wrote about basically this child who was being injected with heroin by his stepfather, and he was addicted to drugs. And so the city, even in Washington in 1991, which is a very crime-ridden city, this shocked everyone, and the city pulled all the stops out to try to find this kid and get him some help, and they couldn't. The D.C. police looked all over the city, looked for this child and couldn't find him. And then Janet Cook later, as she was being awarded the Pulitzer, I think, the story was that she had claimed in her resume that she spoke French or she graduated from Oberlin, I think. And that was a lie, too. And getting caught in that one little lie, then Ben Bradley, the editor of the Washington Post, brought her into his office and asked her to speak French, and she couldn't. And the whole thing unraveled. And I think the Post gave it back. I don't think the Times, I don't think the Pulitzer, she somehow lost her Pulitzer, but I forget what end it happened. That's the closest parallel, but obviously that happened in the moment. It didn't happen decades later. So I'm glad it's being talked about, although I don't know the right thing to do.
All right.
Hi, my name is Lily. I work at Progressive Turnout Project doing voter turnout in the South. And I was wondering what you think the nationalization of news, the impact of that is on local and state elections.
Oh, I think it's so bad for local and state elections. I mean, I'm glad that people read the New York Times, and we do a lot to try to cover, the details of every local election. Cover judges and senator races, but we're never going to have as much as the local journalists would. And I think it leads to a situation where people vote for local candidates based on whatever their national affiliation is, sometimes without really even knowing who they're voting for. That's my problem more broadly with like electing judges, and you're just casting a vote for a party. You have no idea who the person is you're voting for. So that's why I think it's so good places like Texas Tribune and other places are rising up to fill that need and write about the individuals rather than just having voters see it as a reflection of the party. I think tonight in Nebraska, there's a primary where Republican primary, one of the governor candidates has been accused of groping people. Like he has just some, I think, pretty credible allegations as far as I've read. And you wonder how much people know that. Or are they just viewing him through the prism of like, is he, his political affiliation? So I wish there was more coverage of those things, and I think it would be better if there was.
I think we're running out of time.
All right.
I just wanted to take the director's prerogative and ask the last question, but we had, David, a conference here in early April on disinformation and democracy. One of the keynote speakers was Maria Ressa from the Philippines.
Yes.
She's currently under multiple indictments, looking at if she were convicted of all of them, 100 years in prison. And it struck me that we take so much for granted here. And do you find yourself ever worrying about what if the things that we take for granted change? What if a different regimen, different president, different courts take hold, and you don't have the ability to do what you do without great risk?
Yes. You're right that I think we take so much for granted in the U.S. that, that obviously there were journalists who were subjected to physical assault or to threats of violence under the Trump era, but it's nothing like what Maria Ressa deals with in the Philippines, or Russian journalists, or journalists in places all over the world where there's so much bravery involved in just being a journalist and just asking the questions. And I do worry about that. I mean, I worried about that in 2016. My experience, there were things like using wiretaps on journalists. There were some violations of the traditional boundaries of press freedom under Trump, but it was not, I did my job the same way I had always done it. But I do worry, like I said, that we can't count on the fact that it happened in the past to protect us in the future. So yes, it's something that I worry about. There's been so many instances we've had recently where things that we thought, could never happen in America or would never happen because it is America happened. And I worry that will be one of the things that happens in the future. So certainly, yes.
That's also by way of saying how important it is that you do your job, that you do your job, and that we shine a light in the dark corners of our government and quasi-governmental agencies. And, without that lantern, we'd be a fundamentally different society. So,
Absolutely.
So that's my way of saying thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Hey. One of my proudest moments was going to a town board meeting and then getting kicked out, and I said, I represent the people's right to know.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
I just loved that. I thought that was just, like, whoa. David, it was just really terrific to hear from you in person. All of you that are here tonight, oh my gosh, thank you very much. I think the future of journalism, and I hope it's good. I think, let's see the glass half full, okay?